Today we're going to look at Paul's Colossian correspondence, and this includes actually the letter to the Colossians, of course, and also the letter to Philemon. We'll explain why we pair these together and why we call this the Colossian correspondence just a little bit later on. Just to remind you, Colossians is one of the prison epistles. Please recall that this grouping includes Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon. Now, most scholars believe these letters were written while Paul was in Rome, incarcerated in the as it's recorded at the very end of the book of Acts. I would note that we often make an assumption that these have to be the same imprisonment, just because Paul mentions imprisonment in all four of these epistles, that it is of essence the same. It would seem logical that Ephesians and Colossians would come together in the same imprisonment, given the closeness and potentially even literary dependence between the letters. Philemon, as we'll explain a little bit later on, also seems to connect very closely to Colossians, and therefore it would also make sense that that happens during the same imprisonment. Philippians, though, is not necessarily to be connected with Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon in the same way that the other three are connected together. So some scholars, including N.T. Wright, have hypothesized that the imprisonment referred to in Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon is actually an Ephesians imprisonment. Now remember, we don't have a direct reference in the book of Acts to an Ephesians imprisonment. We have some allusions in the Corinthian correspondence, and we have some extra biblical evidence of this, and it certainly would fit plausibly with the narrative of Acts. Nevertheless, we don't have an exact presentation of this possibility within the book of Acts. The imprisonment that's mentioned in Philippi does seem to be very closely connected with Rome. We have a mention of Caesar's household, we have mention of the Praetorian Guard, and while there have been scholars who have noted the possibility that these two references within the book of Philippians might still allow the letter to be placed in a different imprisonment, the preponderance of evidence seems to lean towards a Roman imprisonment. So the question I raise is whether all four of these ought to be grouped together or whether they could be considered different imprisonments. It's a question we can't fully resolve, but one that I wanted to at least introduce you to. The recipients of the letter to the Colossians were the believers in the city of Colossae, and you can see here on the screen that the city of Colossae was in what we call the Lycus River Valley. And if you notice, there are two other cities that are in close proximity to Colossae, Hierapolis and Laodicea. Laodicea, of course, plays into the book of Revelation. It's one of the churches that is addressed in the 7 letters there. And it may also be that Hierapolis and the springs there play a role in interpreting the exhortation to the Laodicean church not to be hot nor cold. So in ancient times, these three cities would have been considered together. They were closely connected. And if you notice up in the upper left-hand side of the graphic here, the Meander River, keep that in mind because I'm going to expand out to a map that's a little bit larger here. And you can place the cities in the context of the larger region of Asia Minor. So you can see Hierapolis and Laodicea. Hierapolis and Colossae are in red, Laodicea in green, and you can see the rivers as they come. Now, I want you to note as well the proximity to the city of Ephesus. And this is why some scholars have argued that the imprisonment that is referred to in Colossians and Philemon is an Ephesians imprisonment. The proximity is very, very possible, given the routes as well that went from between these cities. But nevertheless, this is included in the province of Asia Minor, of which Ephesus was the capital, and it was believers there who received this letter. Paul probably did not personally plant the church in Colossae, and the reason we draw that conclusion comes from Colossians 1:3-4. We always thank God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, when we pray for you, since we heard of your faith in Christ Jesus and of the love that you have for all the saints. It seems that Paul had not become personally acquainted with the believers there. At least it should be said that many of the believers in the church, when Paul wrote the letter, did not know Paul. Of course, those are saying two different things, but if we're extrapolating, we can say that Paul had not been to the cities. The conclusion does seem likely given the tenor of the letter. Like Ephesians, it is somewhat generic in nature, though not as much so as the letter to the Ephesians. Let me show you one other verse here, Colossians 2:1, for I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you, and for those at Laodicea, and for all those who have not seen me face to face. Let me point out one other aspect in terms of the recipients here, and that is Acts 19, referring to Paul's time in Ephesus. It does not say that he went to Colossae, but it does give this indication very strongly in two verses, verse 10 and verse 26, that the gospel was spreading beyond Ephesus to the larger region of Asia. All the residents of Asia heard the word of the Lord, in verse 10, not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia. This Paul has persuaded and turned away a great many people. Now, if you remember the context of the verse in 26, it is the accusation being leveled against Paul. And so one's opponents are not prone to overemphasize the impact that they see as negative. So I think in this sense it brings more credibility that it was not only Luke's perception, it also seems to be the perception of those who were less favorably disposed towards Paul and brought legal action against him. I think Paul's time in Ephesus was marked by a strategy of training and sending, and as you can see, it was a very straight shot from Ephesus to Laodicea and Colossae, and Hierapolis was not too far off the map, off the road there, and this would have been a logical place for some of the people who were sitting under Paul's instruction in the hall of Tyrannus daily to take that knowledge and apply it through church planting in other regions. And specifically by that I mean Epaphras, because the letter Paul writes here specifically says that Epaphras was the one from whom you learned the gospel. Epaphras shows up twice in the letter here. He actually shows up in chapter 4 as well. And as you look at 1:7 here, it appears that Epaphras was instrumental in introducing the gospel to the Colossian context, perhaps to these other cities as well of Laodicea and Hierapolis. He may have been directly involved in planting and leading the church, and my guess is that he was converted under the ministry of Paul in Ephesus and then took the gospel over to Colossae. Chapter 4 says, Epaphras, who is one of you, a servant of Christ Jesus, greets you, always struggling on your behalf in his prayers, that you may stand mature and fully assured in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea and in Hierapolis. The phrase, who is one of you, seems to indicate that Epaphras was from Colossae. And that the end of this verse here, it seems to indicate that his hometown region in the Lycus Valley was his destination for ministry. Now, the name Epaphras is an abbreviation of a name we've already come across, Epaphroditus. This name, of course, appears twice in the letter from the Philippians. And so it's possible that the two names refer to different individuals, but to me, it seems likely that it's the same person because we do see names repeated from epistle to epistle, Luke and Timothy and Silas and so forth. So if this would be an argument for the same imprisonment, possibly, to say that Epaphroditus is with him in Rome because he's mentioned in the book of the Philippians, but it might be a different imprisonment. Nevertheless, we can see that the groups of people that are surrounding Paul and ministering with him remain loyal to him in multiple contexts, and it's very possible that Epaphras was responsible for planting the church in Colossae and then was with Paul on a different occasion in Rome if he was in a Roman imprisonment. Certainly highly possible that he was with him in an Ephesians imprisonment. You might ask the question, why does he have an abbreviated usage of his name in the letter to the Colossians and more formal usage in the letter to the Philippians? I think the answer to that question would just be the nature of the relationship that Epaphras had with the people receiving the letter. He clearly was from and knew well the people in Colossae and the Lycus Valley region, whereas in Philippi he might go by his more formal name, not having the level of familiarity or maybe not even having known them before his gospel ministry there. His name's also mentioned in Philemon 1:23, and so this does begin to tie some of these letters together. Paul indicates that Epaphras was a fellow prisoner with him. We have very little archaeological data from the ancient location of Colossae. In fact, you are there looking at the archaeological site of Colossae. That little mound in the forefront of this picture covers the city of Colossae. They have not dug here. The archaeological data lags far behind places like Ephesus and Corinth, which are essentially excavated down to the 1st century era and provide us a trove of data related to New Testament interpretation, particularly the Pauline epistles. So here in Colossae, we're primarily reliant on coins and literary data that have surfaced to understand what we need to know about the city. The primary interpretive question that comes up for the book of Colossians deals with the Colossian heresy. And we have to ask the question, what was the nature of this heresy that Paul is confronting? Scholars have debated as to whether the heresy develops from something among Jewish converts, whether there's something that develops among Gentile converts, or whether Paul's responding to some sort of a syncretistic amalgamation of both Gentile and Jewish beliefs. It is important to understand the historical context in order to be able to help us unravel some of the questions that we have surrounding this heresy. One aspect of the context that we know about is the predominance of the cult of Cybele. And the cult of Cybele employed both asceticism and ritual mutilation as a part of their practices. Let's make sure we understand both of those terms. Asceticism is a setting aside of legitimate pleasures within life in order to worship or connect with the deity more meaningfully. Ritual mutilation, I think, makes sense. In fact, as you look at the myth of the goddess, she actually compelled another figure to castrate himself so that he would not be drawn to another lover, and some devoted male worshippers would do likewise, according to Ovid. So this idea of being able to commit an act of worship or mutilation in order to please the goddess was very much a part of her worship. She was a Phrygian goddess and had made her way westward into this region. We often find a combination of Eastern and Western as we get to the place that we call Asia Minor. This may be what's behind Colossians 2:23, when it says, "These have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism and severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh." The Apostle Paul says, I don't care what you do, that what may be considered spiritual, this will not help you to find favor with God. A second aspect of pagan worship here relates to Selene and Helios. They were both worshipped in Colossae. Selene was the goddess of the moon in Greek mythology, and Helios was the god of the sun. He personified the sun. This may be the reason that Paul uses darkness and light in his imagery here in Colossians 2:23, where it says, "He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son." Lastly, I would note that Paul seems to refer to the 4 elements of the world in pagan theology. Now, these would be earth, fire, water, and air, represented by this diagram here. These are what we call the elementary principles, and you'll see this in pagan theology. In fact, if you guys probably are too young to remember the opening of the Greek Olympics when they were held in Athens in 2004, but they themed the entire ceremony after these 4 elements here. And it's not the only interpretation, but it's certainly a valid one when Paul says in 2:20, if with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, he may be referring to this aspect of pagan theology that brings these 4 entities together. So really, we are at a bit of a loss historically to try to piece together what the heresy was in Colossae. Quite frankly, we have to deal with the evidence we have in the text itself and then work backwards to try to understand the features The occasion of the letter is for Paul to give an opportunity to address the heresy that has developed there. And so what we have to do is ascertain the characteristics as they are laid out in the letter. So let me give you a few of those. The first is the false teaching denigrated the person of Christ. There was something about this philosophy, this teaching within the church, we could call it even a heresy, that took Jesus down from the exalted place that he ought to have had. Colossians 1:15-16 is one evidence of this. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Colossians 1 is one of the most exalted presentations of Jesus Christ. And in point of fact, if you're going to develop a Christology, it's in the top 5 set of verses that you're going to look at to understand an Orthodox Christology. It's going to be up there with like John 1, Philippians 2, Hebrews 1, and so forth. A second aspect of the heresy is its prohibition on touching certain items. If with Christ you died to the elemental spirits of the world, why, as if you were still alive in the world, do you submit to regulations? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Colossians 2:20-21. There seems to be something about these prohibitions that were included in the heresy, and perhaps these are reflections of the asceticism that we saw from the cult of Sabile. Perhaps they came from Jewish regulations and a misapplication of the Jewish law within the church. I mean, there's a wide range of possibilities as to what this refers, but we can say with certainty there was a prohibition on certain items that Paul felt was certainly not necessary to communicate salvation. Thirdly, self-denial of pleasures was encouraged. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Now, let's be honest, Paul makes this sort of a list in multiple other places without confronting a particular heresy. He often gives a list similar to this just to encourage people to live in a way that is righteous. But I will say that he's usually confronting Gentile converts who have a misunderstanding of how their ethics translate into their Christian faith. Usually is not saying this to Jewish believers. So it does seem to me at least, that this particular aspect of the heresy would augment the idea that there is a substantial pagan component informing the beliefs of the people who are propagating this Colossian heresy. The false teaching was confused about angels. He says, let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels. Apparently, angelic beings had been misplaced in terms of the divine hierarchy, and this may relate to the denigration of Christ, in that Christ was taken down a notch and angels were taken up a notch, perhaps one past the other in an inappropriate way. We don't know exactly, but this was a component of the teaching. Lastly, the false teaching contains some distinctly Jewish components. Even if we argue that it was primarily Gentile in nature, it still had strong reflections of Judaism within the false teaching. Colossians 2:16 is one of the evidences here. Let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. Now, up until Sabbath, I'm probably with the argument that this could as easily be reflecting pagan background as Jewish, because there's certainly questions of food and drink in pagan religion. They have their own festivals. The moon can be related, but the Sabbath is distinctly Jewish. And so in this case, I would argue that there were at least some components of Judaism which had mixed up in this heresy. I would also note that Paul addresses the matter of circumcision at several places within the letter. So somehow that also relates to this heresy, a misunderstanding of the role circumcision plays, and perhaps the broader role of the law. At the end of the day, what is this? Well, we can't exactly say, and I think what's important to note is that understanding how Paul confronts heresy is as important as understanding what the heresy was. Clearly, this was not something that God intended for us to know the full details of. There's something else that he wanted to instruct us with by preserving the letter to the Colossians in the New Testament. And so I think that we need to understand the nature of the heresy as best it's presented, but probably not obsess over identifying what it is without missing the larger lesson for which this was included in the canon. One last thing that I want to make sure you understand is the role that Gnosticism, as the potential candidate for the heresy, has played within the history of scholarship related to the letter to the Colossians. Some scholars have noted what we call a proto-Gnosticism evidenced in Colossians. This would say that we don't have a full-blown reflection of Gnosticism, but we have sort of the beginnings of it reflected at an earlier date. I should say the problem with Gnosticism is that we have no record of it outside of the New Testament until the 2nd century. There's just no indication of its existence or prominence. Now, in all fairness, this could come from a lack of sources. The fact that we don't have sources indicating this is not a sure bet that it didn't exist in the 1st century. Our sources are limited. But even though we have a very limited set of historical sources, we still have enough to give us a fairly good picture of the 1st century, and at least from a historical standpoint, and to have nothing on this is a very large gap that people have a hard time overcoming. And so the argument for proto-Gnosticism says we acknowledge that Gnosticism is a 2nd century phenomenon, but we see that it didn't come out of a vacuum, that it started somewhere, and the New Testament reflects the beginnings of this thought and actually gives us evidence. And I would, quite personally, I would subscribe to this view, because it's not only Colossians where we see this argument regarding Gnosticism. There are other places in the New Testament where we deal with this as well. And I don't think things come out of a vacuum. I think it's rather insidious, actually, to decide that the New Testament is not a 1st century source. Quite frankly, it's an excellent 1st century source. It's well documented, it's well attested, it's well preserved. And so to argue that we have to have some evidence outside of the New Testament is a standard that isn't applied to many, many other works of literature that we have from the 1st century. We can have one record of something from another source, and we easily say, oh, this is probable that such and such happened based on so-and-so's writing it. But for some reason, we're not willing to grant the Apostle Paul the same luxury. And of course, I think it's a larger skepticism about the truth that's revealed in Scripture that sometimes perpetuates this idea that the New Testament is not a valid literary source when others perhaps carry more weight. So I think a proto-Gnostic approach is probably a very fair one. Whether that was actually the heresy or not, I don't know. But in terms of the debate over 1st or 2nd century authorship of the letter to the Colossians, I would argue that proto-Gnosticism could fit a Pauline authorship perspective, and there's no need to move this to a 2nd century authorship just based on the presence of some sort of Gnostic ideology in the book. There are some, such as F.C. Bauer, who see a fuller 2nd century Gnosticism, and as they're going to move this letter to the 2nd century, they're going to make it pseudonymous, someone who's imitating the Apostle Paul. I just quite frankly see that as an unnecessary step. There are pagan philosophies that could potentially explain the elements seen through the Colossian correspondence. There's no need to even move to Gnosticism to explain some of the aspects we see, and I'll give you an example of that. Pythagorean teaching understood the sun, the moon, and the stars to be spirits that controlled human destiny. And they engaged in ascetic practices, including ritual washings, abstinence from food, sexual contact, in order to, catch this, purify their soul so that after death it might pass through the regions where these celestial beings dwelt. Well, if that doesn't sound what Colossians is talking about, I don't know what is. Now, can I say for sure that the Pythagorean philosophy regarding celestial beings and the attendant ascetic practices and ritual washings are what Paul is confronting here? No, I cannot say that at all, but I can say that's a legitimate explanation for what's here that fully fits the 1st century, and therefore I see no need to move us into the 2nd century. Making some conclusions here. First of all, we can see that Christ is Lord over all. Paul clearly affirms Christ's lordship. Secondly, nothing serves as an intermediary for Jesus. There is no angel, there is no person, nothing and no one is between us and Jesus. Jesus is our intermediary between us and the Father. Thirdly, believers must be ethically distinct from unbelievers. This is a very firm conclusion that Paul makes, that how we live has to look different than people who do not follow Christ. Fourthly, Christ's ultimate or cosmic victory is declared and anticipated. He is exalted as Lord over all and as the person who rules over all. And it's a very beautiful picture of Christ's reign in the book of Colossians. And lastly, salvation comes through Christ's magnificent grace, not through self-effort. So you can see that the themes that surface in Colossians are very similar to what we see in Galatians, in the sense that there is nothing that can bring us salvation apart from Jesus Christ. And any way in which we look to some other means of salvation is going to leave us empty. De Silva offers an excellent summary assessment of this, and I just want to read you a quote that comes from his New Testament survey. He says, quote, "The Colossians philosophy truly remains an unsolved puzzle, but its major contours are fairly well defined. Human life below and access to the realm above lie under the authority of intermediate spiritual beings, variously called angels, elemental spirits, principles, and the like. Ascetic practices and rigorous self-discipline were required either in obedience to these beings or as the means to enter into visionary experiences of them. Positive interaction with these beings was probably regarded as, in some sense, necessary for human beings to move into the fullness of the divine realm or experience the fullness of God." So whatever the nature of this heretical perspective in Colossae, Paul's response is very clear. Christ is Lord. Nothing is between us and Jesus. We must be distinct from unbelievers in how we live. Christ ultimately has the victory, and salvation comes from Christ's grace in our lives and not us ourselves. Like Ephesians, Colossians is not as rooted in particular circumstances, and so it becomes a more theologically oriented book. Now, I argued when we had our lecture on Ephesians that we have to be very careful about assuming that there's this strong distinction between doctrine and practice. The letter to the Colossians has some lofty doctrinal proclamations. It also has some very practical exhortations as to how we should live. But I did think it would be helpful to understand the flow of thought in the letter to the Colossians so that you can see how it all unfolds. It's not a very long letter, but it is power-packed. And so I'm going to play a short video for you here to help you be able to see the flow of thought as it's presented. This is about 9 minutes long.
Paul's letter to the Colossians. It was written during one of Paul the Apostle's many imprisonments for announcing Jesus as the risen Lord. And the letter is addressed to a group of people that Paul had never met who made up a church community that he didn't start. This church in Colossae was started by a co-worker of Paul's named Epaphras, who was actually from that city. And Epaphras had recently visited Paul in prison, and he updated him on how well the Colossians were doing overall, but he also mentioned some of the cultural pressures tempting them to turn away from Jesus. And so Paul wrote this letter to encourage the Colossians to address the issues that Epaphras had raised, and then to challenge them to a greater devotion to Jesus. The letter's design and flow of thought are pretty easy to follow. The opening movement focuses on Jesus as the exalted Messiah. Paul then goes on to show how his suffering in prison is for the exalted Jesus. And then he addresses the pressures tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. After this, he explores the new way of life that Jesus' resurrection opened up for them. So the letter opens with two prayers. Paul first thanks God that he learned from Epaphras that the Colossians have been totally faithful to Jesus, showing love for God and their neighbors, all because of the hope they have in the new creation that Jesus has in store. And so he moves on to pray that they would grow in their wisdom and understanding about Jesus. And then Paul has placed a poem here to help the Colossians and us do exactly that. It's the centerpiece of chapter 1, a poem all about the crucified and exalted Messiah. It has 2 parallel stanzas, and it's crammed with language and imagery from the books of Genesis and Exodus, from the Psalms and the Proverbs. The first stanza explores how Jesus is the true image of God. In him, the full character and purpose of God is embodied in a human. He's the firstborn, an Old Testament phrase about Jesus' royal status over all creation. He shares in the very identity of the one true Creator God. And by him, all reality, all powers and authorities, spiritual and human, have been created. It's in Jesus the Messiah that we discover the very author and king of creation. And so in the second stanza, we discover he's also the one bringing about a new creation. He's the head of a new body, which refers to Jesus' people, who are the new humanity, of which his own resurrection existence is a prototype. In him, God's glorious temple presence dwells, and so it's through Jesus' death and resurrection that God has reconciled himself to humanity, to all spiritual powers, to all of creation. It's a remarkable poem, and Paul will keep referring back to it as he goes on in the letter. So he first shows how the truth of this poem transforms his own experience of suffering in prison. He's being punished for announcing to the Greek and the Roman world that Jesus is the resurrected Lord and King of all. And so his suffering, he thinks, is not a sign of defeat. It's actually his way of participating in Jesus' own suffering done as an act of love. And so his hardships are actually a cause for joy. He's imprisoned for the surprising news that Israel's resurrected Messiah is creating a new multi-ethnic family. And more, just as the divine glory dwelt in Jesus, so Jesus dwells in and among his international family. Or as Paul says, the Messiah is in you all, the hope of glory. Paul then addresses the cultural pressures that are tempting the Colossians to turn away from Jesus. They were confronted by a combination of mystical polytheism along with a pressure to observe the laws of the Torah. So all these new Christians, they had grown up worshiping the various Greek and Roman gods who governed different arenas of human life. And many simply included Jesus as one more deity that they could worship. There was also great pressure from the Jewish Christian community for these non-Jews to complete their commitment to the Messiah by following all of the laws found in the Torah. Specifically, he mentions eating a kosher diet, observing sacred days, and circumcision. It's very similar to the problem he addressed in the letter to the Galatians. For Paul, to give in to either of these temptations is compromise. It's a failure to grasp who Jesus really is and what he did on their behalf. The Colossians used to live in fear of spiritual powers and elemental spirits, as Paul calls them. But Jesus triumphed over these through his death and resurrection. He freed the Colossians from any obligation to them. In the same way, Jesus fulfilled on our behalf all of the laws of the Torah, which never had the power to transform the selfish human heart anyway. And so what Jesus did in his life and death and resurrection, it lacks nothing. It doesn't need to be supplemented by following the laws. He is the reality to which all of the laws of the Torah were pointing anyway. Instead of the laws, followers of Jesus have the power of his resurrection to change them, which is what he goes on to explore. Following Jesus means joining his new humanity because their lives have now been joined to the risen Jesus' life. And this is why Paul challenges the Colossians to set their minds on things above, where the Messiah is seated or rules at God's right hand. Now, Paul doesn't mean here, think about how you'll one day leave earth and go to heaven. Rather, the heavens are the transcendent place from which Jesus rules now over all of creation. And from there, he will one day return here to transform all things. Or, as Paul says, when the Messiah who is your life is revealed, you too will be revealed with him in glory. So Paul challenges them to live in the present as the kinds of new humans they will one day become. He uses the image of their old humanity, characterized by distorted sexuality and destructive speech. For Christians, that humanity died with Jesus and has been replaced by his own new humanity, which is characterized by mercy and generosity, by forgiveness and love. And this humanity, it transcends the ethnic and social boundary lines of our world to create, in Paul's words, a people where there is no one Greek or Jewish, circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul then gets really practical, and he shows the Colossians what this new humanity might look like in a first-century Roman household, which was a highly authoritarian institution where the male patriarch held the power of life and death over his wife and children and slaves. Not so in a Christian household. Here, the risen Jesus is the true Lord. And so, in the Lord, the wife allows her husband to become responsible for her, and the husband is subject to Jesus by loving his wife and placing her well-being above his own. In a home where Jesus is Lord, children are not objects, but are called to maturity and to respect, and parents are to raise their children with patience and understanding. Christians who are slaves are to honor their human masters precisely because they're not the real master. Jesus is. And Christians who have slaves are to understand that this slave is not their property, but rather a fellow member of Jesus' body to be honored and embraced in love. And Paul's walking a very fine line here. He is reshaping the most basic Roman institution around Jesus, who rules by his self-giving love. And so while he doesn't abolish the household structure outright, the exalted Messiah demands that it be transformed, almost beyond the point of recognition for any Roman living in Colossae. You can see this most clearly in the letter's conclusion. After a request for prayer, Paul applies these instructions about Christian slaves and masters. And we discover that Tychicus is the one carrying and reading this letter to the Colossians, and he's accompanied by a certain Onesimus, who was a former slave to a Colossian Christian named Philemon. And we discover from another letter addressed to Philemon that Onesimus had escaped from his master. It was a crime worthy of imprisonment. But Paul asks the whole church to greet Onesimus as a faithful and beloved brother in the Lord. And then in the letter to Philemon, Paul says that he should receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a brother. Talk about ending the letter with a punch. So in the letter to the Colossians, Paul is inviting us to see that no part of human existence remains untouched by the loving and liberating rule of the risen Jesus. Our suffering, our temptation to compromise, our moral character, the power dynamics in our homes, all of it must be re-examined and transformed. We are invited to live in the present as if the new creation really arrived when Jesus rose from the dead. And that's what the letter to the Colossians is all about.
So appreciative to the Bible Project for an excellent presentation to help us understand the flow of thought within the book of Colossians. And as they introduced in the very end of the video, you can see that the connection between Philemon and Colossians is very strong. It appears that Onesimus was a runaway slave, and that he ended up converting while he was away from his master. I have not put the term runaway slave in the statement here, and that's very intentional, actually. I said Onesimus is the slave who is not in the good graces of his master Philemon, because quite frankly, we don't know that he has run away. What we know from the letter to Philemon was that Onesimus had done something which made him lawfully subject to some punishment. And Paul is asking Philemon to forego the deserved consequences in light of the fact that Onesimus is now a believer in Jesus Christ. So what exactly were the circumstances surrounding that? We can't exactly say. I do ask the question, what are the odds of a slave who is running away from Asia ending up in Rome and meeting the Apostle Paul? God can do anything, but the odds are pretty slim. It would seem more likely to me, maybe more plausible, that Onesimus had been a trusted slave of Philemon's and had been sent to Rome to meet with Paul. And in the execution of those responsibilities, maybe he had stolen something from Philemon or was refusing to return or something along that line. And that this is the circumstance that brought Onesimus and Paul together. Of course, this also feeds into the question of where the imprisonment was. If Paul was in Ephesus, it would be more likely that Onesimus might run away from the city of Colossae and end up in Ephesus, much closer by. But nevertheless, we don't know exactly the nature of the circumstances, nor do we have to. Just like with the Colossian heresy, we only know what we've been given, so the lessons that we are to take away from this must reside in the information that we have. Whatever the case, Onesimus had met Paul, he had followed Christ, and he now needs to return to Philemon. Paul's argument was that Onesimus' conversion to Christ should affect the way that Philemon and Onesimus relate to one another. And as was noted in the video from the Bible Project, we should also read Colossians 3:22 to 4:1 in light of the circumstances with Philemon, which it says this: "Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ, for the wrongdoer will be paid back for the wrong he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven." And so the step that Paul is taking in Colossians is to place both slave and master under the authority of the Lord Jesus Christ. Basically, if a slave does wrong to his master, he's going to be paid back because God is not partial. God will bring consequences for those choices. And likewise, a master has to treat a bondservant or a slave justly and fairly. Why? Because he has a master in heaven, someone to whom he is accountable. So in the end, the principle that Paul is conveying is that being in Christ means something different for master and slave. For slave, it means that you work heartily and willingly and honestly. And for a master, it means that you are not harsh and that you recognize the dignity of this person as a fellow believer in Jesus Christ. Onesimus returns from Rome with Tychicus to bring the letter to the Colossian believers, and in all likelihood, the letter to Philemon also comes with Tychicus on Onesimus's behalf. Let's talk about slavery for a little bit, because this is such an important part of both Colossians and Philemon. We should spend some time trying to understand first century Roman slavery. In particular, we need to understand it because the institution was radically different than slavery as we know it from antebellum America. And so I want to walk you through some aspects of what slavery would have looked like. As an institution, it's important to know that over 50% of the population were either slaves or freed slaves. Freedmen is a category of people who had once been slaves but then were brought into a different status. They were not the same as a slave owner, but they were someone who had progressed. The population of slaves in the mid-first century was about 33%, and this varied from city to city, but there was a large part of the population that were actually considered slaves. Jews were considered hard workers, and thus they were considered good slaves. And we find Jews throughout the Roman Empire. The Romans had conquered Jerusalem, and part of the reason that we find Jewish presence throughout the empire as the Apostle Paul travels is precisely because of Jews being enslaved and spread throughout the empire. In particular, Antioch and Corinth had Jewish slaves. Thus, Paul would have been very personally familiar with the institution of slavery. Having spent a great deal of time in Antioch and having launched from this city on all three of his missionary journeys, and of course in Corinth as well, because he spent a year and a half there on his first visit, the second missionary journey, and 3 months there on the third missionary journey. And as we noted in our lecture on the Corinthian correspondence, also appears that he spent another period of time there on a visit recorded in the letters, but not in the book of Acts. Ancient perceptions of slavery are not what you anticipate them being. We, of course, see slavery as a negative word, but there's no ancient government, not even the Jewish government, that sought to abolish slavery. No former slaves who became writers ever attacked the institution. We have documented rebellions of slaves, but these were surprisingly aimed at curbing abuses rather than the abolition of slavery. And the ironic reality is that poor freedmen actually experienced more abuse because owners had a vested interest in their property, in their slaves. So they would a lot of times treat that which they owned better than that which they didn't. So promoting from the status slave to freedman sometimes brought a downgrade in your treatment from a slave owner, which is a bit ironic. So ancient perceptions were definitely not antagonistic on the part of all parties involved. It was an accepted and assumed reality. How did one get slaves? Well, essentially, the way slaves were acquired was from Roman armies conquering territories. They would bring captives back and they would auction them as slaves. The thing to remember here is that this is not a practice that was associated with a particular race of people, with a particular age or gender. You could bring back someone who was a well-educated elite and sell them off as a slave who could be a pedagogue within the household. Or you could bring back someone who was a brute laborer and sell them off into the mines. So there was a great variety of prior occupations for people who were sold into slavery. Many Romans actually even sold themselves into slavery in order to gain stable economic situations or a decent living, because there was a way in which being a slave actually provided some sense of obligation on the part of the master for taking care of you. Of course, there's a distinction between household slaves and other forms of labor, and very few people would sell themselves into these less advantageous forms of slavery. Many slaves came from the eastern portion of the empire, and this includes Palestine. Manumission is the freedom of a slave, and it was actually extremely common. In fact, by the 1st century, it had become so common that Augustus had set up laws to restrict the practice. They were concerned that slaves would comprise freed slaves would comprise too much a part of the population for the elite to maintain a measure of control. Now, a slave could request manumission, but he could not require it of his master. The way it worked was that you had to pay for the loss to your master. So it's sort of like completing a mortgage, if you will. The bank owns your house or your car. If you pay off the principal on that, then they let you go because you've made up their loss, so to speak. And slavery was treated in much the same way. If a master granted manumission to a slave could not refuse it. It was expected that you would accept it. And you might say, well, why wouldn't they? Well, as we said earlier, sometimes slavery was actually a stabilizing force for people in their life, economically and otherwise. And actually, it was very common, as it was after the Civil War as well, for slaves to remain in the service of their master, even as a freed man. They were just paid for it. There was a process that we call sacral manumission, and this was involved a religious component of the ceremony. They would go to the temple where the deity was worshipped, and the parties viewed the deity as mediating the transaction. So it was interesting to see how one's spirituality, even in a pagan sense, connected with your concept of freedom. And so the Apostle Paul seems to be tagging on to this and saying, well, we as Christians can also see manumission in light of our faith. Manumission was an implementation, by implementation of a will upon death of the master, was granted by ceremony before a magistrate. So a lot of times when someone died, they would grant their slaves freedom, and then you would go and get it certified by a judge. Romans used slave labor for everything, from work in the mines, building roads, construction projects, public works. I mean, everywhere you went, there were slaves. That you'd find them in the government, you'd find them in households. Paul seems to be writing primarily about the category we would call household slaves. They served as artisans, business persons, pedagogues, taking care of the practical matters of the house. And we should definitely note that this was a better way to be a slave than, say, working in the mines or building roads throughout the vast reaches of the empire. And so some people have thought of Paul's exhortation regarding slavery in a more limited sense, not as an institution, but really in describing household slavery as a practice, as a subset of slavery. And actually, I think this makes a lot of sense because in reality, Paul is dealing with the social structure of the Roman family as transformed by Jesus Christ, and that's going to affect the way that slaves and believers who are not slaves relate within the context of the household. What was the social status of a slave? Well, they were considered to be living property. They had no legal rights per se. If they needed to go to court, they had to have their master go on behalf of them. They could not appeal anything. But it was possible for a slave to save money in order to purchase manumission if the owner desired to grant it. They did receive some measure of compensation, although it wouldn't have been much, but they did receive some for their work. Many slaves came from moneyed backgrounds, and they had education, and sometimes they had the responsibility of managing an estate or even tutoring the master's children. We even have some literary evidence of people who were freedmen feeling the obligation to come and visit a slave. So the status as slave was not as much social denigration as it was a statement of one's rights and one's position legally within the society, as well as, at times, a description of one's role. So in this sense, it might be like someone who is in our country who is, say, an undocumented worker. So we use that phrase. What does that mean? It doesn't actually, or shouldn't, although sometimes it is, I guess, but it shouldn't actually make a comment on that person's humanity, their capacity to work well, who they are. It's a comment on their legal status and to some degree their role within our culture. And this is sort of the way slavery was. It was not a comment on one's humanity explicitly. However, there is an implicit reference. When any person owns another person, you have violated some principles that exist, I think, regarding who we are as image bearers of God. And so the fascinating reality here is that we have the Apostle Paul accepting and simultaneously confronting slavery. Let me explain that by discussing the early Christians' perspective on slavery. We have several references within the book of Acts to household conversions. If you remember back to Philippi, we have the household of Lydia, which converts. Lydia was a wealthy businesswoman and undoubtedly had slaves in her household. We have the Philippian jailer. Also, someone, it says specifically, his entire household was baptized. And so we couldn't say for sure, but in all likelihood, this referred to not just the immediate family, but also slaves. So from the very get-go, it is very, very likely that slaves were among some of the first Christian converts. And so Paul is dealing with an issue that is of immense practicality within the church because you have believers who are slaves within the church. we do have extra biblical evidence that Christians often purchase the freedom of slaves within the church. Like I said, a slave could work towards manumission, and this was seen as a business transaction. If you could pay off for the loss, it often was granted by the master, and then that person might even continue in service of that master as a different status instead of being a slave. So it was not uncommon for the church to raise the funds that were necessary to help that person move out of slavery. The Apostle Paul discusses the opportunity to move out of the status of slave in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, if you can do it, absolutely do it. Any other social status, keep it the same. If you're married to an unbeliever, stay married. Don't try to change. If you're born as a Jew and you're circumcised, don't change that. If you're born as a Gentile, don't change that. Stay as you are, Paul says. But the one exception he gives is related to slavery. And perhaps that's because it was actually required that you accept that change of status. There are many other places that Paul addresses the issue of slavery. Of course, in Philemon, which we're looking at here, Colossians 3:22-4:1, which we read earlier. We have the parallel to this in Ephesians 6:5-9, of course. But we also see in 1 Timothy chapter 6, 1-2, we see the importance of honoring the master. We see the importance of the slave not taking advantage of his master just because he's a believer. And then in Romans 6-8, we don't see it addressed as a social institution, but we see the image of slavery used to describe the process of sanctification, how we are enslaved to our fleshly nature, and Christ has freed us from that. So it's very fascinating to read Romans 6-8 in light of Roman practices in slavery and manumission. So this is a real issue for the early church. The question is it an issue for us? Can or should we share Paul's perspective, and why or why not? And of course, if we were together, we would have a robust discussion on this, because the Apostle Paul essentially allows slavery to continue. He does not come to Philemon and say, you should offer Onesimus manumission because he is a believer. Even if he's implying manumission, he is offering to pay. In other words, he's working within the social protocols of the day and not challenging them explicitly. This can be bothersome to modern Christians. He does the same thing in Colossians and Ephesians, where he essentially says, not that slaves should not be slaves. He says that slaves should work hard and be honest, and that masters should be good to their slaves. But he doesn't say, you know what, we're all believers now. We need to get rid of this insidious institution. Paul is not functioning as William Wilberforce did. He's not functioning as Harriet Beecher Stowe did. He doesn't make these arguments. And so this leaves us in a position of confusion, actually, to some degree, as modern believers. So how do we answer this? How do we deal with this? How do we be honest with the Scriptures and not try to make the Scriptures say something that they don't? Well, here are the lessons that I draw from Paul's approach to slavery. First of all, I can see that the Apostle Paul actually gives an implicit rationale for the undoing of slavery. And what he began in the first century by creating a human relationship between slave and master actually was the fuel that flamed the fire of abolition later in human history. Even if Paul chooses to accept the social institution of slavery, he does nothing philosophically to perpetuate it permanently. He actually plants the seed that eventually grows and blossoms, to use a separate analogy here. Secondly, I would argue that the Apostle Paul affirms that we do not have to upend social order in order to find complete obedience to Christ. There are times when we need to operate within the existing social order in a very Christian manner. And so this is a difficult concept for us as Americans to conceptualize. We believe that social change is the means by which we often accomplish the Lord's will. But as you dialogue with Chinese believers, Indian believers, Russian believers, other places around the world who are not given the same freedoms that we are to perpetuate social change, you will find that they have a very different perspective on this. They welcome it, but they don't see it as an essential component in their Christian worldview. So they have worked out a means by which they can find complete obedience to Christ within the context of their social framework, while yearning and longing for the redemption that will come in the kingdom. This seems to be the approach the Apostle Paul takes. I believe that when we sit down with the Apostle Paul in heaven, that he will say, no, I think slavery was a bad idea, that it was sub-biblical, that it dehumanized people in a way that was not effective. But the means by which that ought to be redeemed were not of immediate necessity, that it was going to be ultimately redeemed in human history later, and finally at the end of time. What Paul does do is that he equalizes slave and master within the spiritual realm, such that when a slave and a master come into the fellowship of believers together, in that moment, there is no ranking that separates them. Slave and master alike can worship the Lord with equal reverence and status. And I would even say that within the context of church governance, it is possible that a slave could hold a position of authority over and above a master, depending on the leadership structure of the church. We see hints of this reality in 1 Corinthians 11, when the Apostle Paul discusses the inappropriate usage of the Lord's Supper. And he says, some of you guys are getting drunk and eating too much. Other people are going hungry. And this was the reality of having communion in a home where the rich and wealthy were sitting in the triclinium and being served twice as a part of the regular feast, of which the Lord's Supper was incorporated into. And those who were slaves were coming later, after they were done with their day's labor, and they were coming in the tail end of it, but they weren't receiving communion as the others were who were more wealthy. And so Paul is saying, you can't do that. And we see other hints of this. Colossians talks about the equality of believers. Galatians 3:28, neither male nor female, slave nor free. Paul repeats this in 1 Corinthians, actually 12 as well. There are multiple places where Paul emphasizes this equality socially when you come into the church, in terms of gender when you come into the church. And so I think that the way we read Paul's take on slavery is to factor in the complete and utter equality that he emphasizes within the context of the church, while trying to understand his rationale for not perpetuating that within the social structure. This is a complicated reality for us as Americans to apprehend, but we have to begin to get our hands around it, because this is what is given to us in the Holy Scriptures. This, of course, is a separate question of what we should do today. Does the New Testament justify slavery? And is it right for us as Christians to advocate against slavery? I think the answer to that is no and yes. No, it is not right for a Christian to own slaves, and I don't think that that should happen today. The theological argument for that was well settled during the Civil War era in the United States, where many pastors actually argued in favor of slavery. But the exegetical rationale was thoroughly vetted, and I don't think it came up as being sufficient. The Bible does not justify slavery by any means. And then should we advocate? Yes, I think we should, because I think we have the historical progression of thought, and we have a different context. Slavery was such an integral fabric of Roman society that it would have upended the entire social structure to have eliminated slavery. But we are not in that situation today. In most cultures and contexts around the world, the alternate economic systems certainly allow for a freedom of people without being owned, and the economic structure can be perpetuated successfully. So I think the capacity that we have socially and economically to address slavery is different than what existed for the Apostle Paul. We are stewards of our times, and we must take advantage of our own times. Well, by way of conclusion, what is the modern value of Paul's Colossian correspondence? I would just submit to you four things for consideration. First of all, it provides us a model for confronting heresy. How does Paul confront heresy? Well, he does it forthrightly, and he does it with shepherdly concern. And this is how we should also confront heresy. We need to not pat people on the back, make them feel good always. There are times when we need to come and say, this is getting between you and Christ, and there are eternal matters at stake. And we need to be willing, like the Apostle Paul, to stand up and call something what it is. What's fascinating is that he doesn't get animated about slavery and challenging the institution, but what he does get animated about is someone whose understanding of the gospel is confused because they have brought in ideas from other contexts that have caused them to think incorrectly about their salvation. Well, there's a lot of that going on around us today, and I think we need to be as animated and exercised about that as we are about other social causes as well. Secondly, he emphasizes the interconnectedness of the ecclesia in the Colossian correspondence. Quite frankly, you have names of people that come from a variety of points in Paul's ministry, and he's here in prison, probably in Rome, possibly in Ephesus. He's keeping up with a church that he's never been to, or at least didn't plant, but you have this interconnected web of believers who are perpetuating the gospel, and this should encourage us in a time of COVID-19 when we feel a bit isolated and disconnected. But the entirety of the Apostle Paul's ministry, with the exception of where he was at that time, was done remotely. And he found many ways to bring about community and to shepherd and care for people, even though he was quite distanced from them. The Apostle Paul was committed to this, and he saw the ecclesia as an organism that was organically connected across cities and across the empire, and he fostered this by his correspondence. So no matter where the location, he was staying in touch with people, encouraging and supporting them, and encouraging them to do the same, actually, in emulation of him. The third is to understand that this is an essential text to understand and establish an Orthodox Christology. As we said earlier, we need to study Colossians chapter 1. Christology, because it was so decided, so decisively in the beginning part of the church's history, is often an aspect of theology that we do not emphasize to the same degree now. People cannot articulate Christology as effectively as they can other aspects of doctrine. And so we need to remedy that. We need to make sure that the next generation of believers is able to articulate an Orthodox Christology, and Colossians is a critical book in doing that. And lastly, it demonstrates the transformative ethical impact of the gospel. Here you have a group of people who are mixing up their Jewish backgrounds, their Gentile backgrounds, trying to figure out what it means to be a Christian. And one thing that Paul makes very clear in the midst of all the confusion is that following after Jesus Christ changes the way you live. And this is a wonderful message for us today, because we live in a mixed up world. We live in a world that's heading 1,000 directions, most of them away from Christ. And we as believers need to be transformed by the way we live. This is the way that the gospel will have an impact in the context with which we live and minister. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you in understanding Paul's Colossian correspondence. Please don't forget to take your quiz, and do that by Monday at midnight. We'll see you on Wednesday for our class discussion on passages related to Colossians and Philemon.